When dealing with the murky world of horror, there are so many brilliant sounding scenes that ultimately fans don't get to see. Now, some of these may eventually wind up as a special feature on a later home release, but there are some that don't even get that privilege. Heck, some were filmed but cut by producers, others were removed and have since been lost to time, and then there's those other ones, well, for others, a director may have simply opted to go in a different direction at the very last minute. So with that in mind then, I'm Andrew from What Culture Horror, and here are 16 horror movie deleted scenes we desperately need to see. Scream 4, the alternate opening. Scream 4 was far from bad, but there's somewhat split opinion when it released in 2011. Some saw it as an unnecessary addition to a perfectly solid trilogy. Others saw it as a welcome palate cleanser after not being all that happy with Scream 3. However, one thing most can agree on is that Scream 4's opening was a little bit too much, a little too meta for its own good, with multiple skits and fake-outs. There was an alternative opening though that felt like a much neater fit, one that shows the grisly consequences of poking fun and messing with the legacy of Ghostface. Rather than the faux stab 6 or stab 7 parts of the Scream 4 opening, we instead go straight to Jenny and Marnie, the very real first victims of Scream 4's lead-in. Only this time, the pair's scene plays out slightly differently. The two girls prank each other, one doing the classic Ghostface phone call, the other then pretending to have been killed by Ghostface. As an example of being careful what you wish for, the girls settle down to watch a movie, only for the very real, very murderous Ghostface to appear in the corner of the room, and with that, it's only a minute later that both Jenny and Marnie have been well and truly sliced and diced. The Fly, Baboon Cat. As if The Fly wasn't already off the wall enough in its portrayal of a scientist getting his calculations very, very wrong, there was almost a scene that made it all even a bit weirder. The story of Seth Brundle engineering a successful teleportation while accidentally merging his DNA with a housefly is a body horror masterpiece from the legendary David Cronenberg, showing the deterioration of the human form and psyche. However, there was nearly some added gloopy madness, and one scene left on the cutting room floor saw Brundle try to replicate the fusion process by putting a baboon and a cat together, cause what could go wrong? Yep, in turn he created a bizarre mishmash of a monster that, yep, poor Seth, he had to club it to death. Supposedly, some test audiences vomited at this very scene, not to mention it took away some of the sympathy you had for Seth Brundle. So yeah, this unique sight was removed entirely from the final cut. Alien, the Cocoon. Alien is home to some of the most iconic scenes in cinema history, and by extension of that, some of the most iconic deleted scenes in cinema history too. In Sir Ridley Scott's original Alien, we of course have a crew attempting to survive when a brutal, aggressive, 8-foot, acid-blooded creature is set loose on the Nostromo, and starts to pick all of them off one by one. For poor Dallas, he heads into a duct and is ambushed by the Xenomorph, and that's pretty much the last we see of him. However, that isn't the last thing that Ridley Scott filmed for Dallas, as there was an extended sequence featuring a half-digested Dallas grouped to the wall, left to die next to the body of Brett. Once Ripley discovers poor Dallas, she puts him out of his misery with a flamethrower, because of course. While this extended sequence was added to the director's cut of Alien years later, even then it's still missing Ripley's dialogue from the moment. King Kong, the Spider Pit. Sure, the modern King Kong movies may feel more like action spectacle rather than outright horror, but the 1933 King Kong very much leaned on horror at certain points, including one scene that was clipped for being too fantastic. There, the sailors stuck on Skull Island were dropped into a pit of monsters, who shortly turn up and tear the doomed group to pieces. Now, the filmmaking process of the 1930s, it was obviously very different to what we have in modern day, as in, deleted scenes were usually immediately destroyed because they simply no longer served a purpose. And so, this sequence is pretty much the stuff of legend at this point, removed from King Kong for being too terrifying for audiences of the time and for distracting them from the rest of the movie, with a bunch of people being eaten alive by giant spiders deemed a little too much for the 1930s. However, not just did Peter Jackson recreate this sequence for his own 2005 Kong movie, he actually used that film's leftover budget to reconstruct the original 1933 reel, well, to the best of his ability, that is. The Devil's Rejects, Dr. Satan. Yes, Dr. Satan! Arguably Rob Zombie's very best movie, The Devil's Rejects is full of gnarly, brutal, brutal, bloody, disgusting, horrible action. But one scene left on the cutting room floor involved the fan favorite Dr. Satan character, a deranged, murderous character whose reputation very much preceded them before he finally popped up at the end of House of a Thousand Corpses. The good doctor was shown here in Devil's Rejects, subdued in a hospital bed, all as a result of the shootout from the beginning of that film. As Officer Dobson flirts with a nurse, actually played by none other than Rosario Dawson, Dr. Satan awakens, grabs the nurse around the throat, and literally pulls her throat out, resulting in a daft amount of blood as Dobson's date bites the dust. As for why this scene was cut from the film, Rob Zombie opted against bringing Dr. Satan back due to the vastly different tone between House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects. However, the director was at least kind enough to eventually include that deleted scene in the special features on certain home releases of his second movie. Us, the Nutcracker. As a director, Jordan Peele has marked himself as one of the very best names in horror these days, with him currently, as of this recording, on a 3-for-3 streak with Get Out, Us, and Nope. And to circle in on that second movie, Us is such a great example of how Peele paints a vivid picture of society at its very, very worst, depicting a family confronted and hunted by their own doppelgangers, culminating in protagonist Adelaide and her double Red performing a ballet dance together in flashback form, Red tethered to the underground and Adelaide performing on stage. In this deleted scene, Jordan Peele gives some foreshadowing, nicely done, as Adelaide, really Red in disguise, speaks to Kitty about transforming her dance from a duet to a solo performance, all as the crowd goes wild. As we learn later, the dance is actually one that was shared across the tethered connection, and the moment that Red took enough control of herself and the other doppelgangers to break out of their underground prison. It's a small, arbitrary conversation, but one given an enormous amount of weight by the movie's surrounding context. My Bloody Valentine, Lost Lovers. When longtime Wes Craven editor Patrick Lussier decided to remake My Bloody Valentine, the Canadian filmmaker did all he could to up the ante when it came to gore and nudity, bringing some truly outrageous brutality, and that one, particularly long nude scene that managed to push the buttons of many censors, even in a post-torture porn world. However, Lussier still couldn't top the 1981 original film, whose many once censored scenes have been recovered over the decades. Although, that film's director, George Mihalka, has often discussed one particular scene of which there now sadly exists no footage. This ambitious scene saw lovebirds Mike and Harriet skewered together by a mining drill, and as Mihalko's described, this would have involved Harriet closing her eyes and opening her mouth to kiss Mike, only for his blood to drop into that mouth, all before the film's killer miner stabs through the two of them all at once. As George Mihalka has sadly stated, that scene had to be taken out totally. It has disappeared, and we'll never see it, so that's pretty definitive. Psycho, a more explicit cut. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho provided the blueprint for slasher cinema before the subgenre was even invented, being one of only a precious few horror films to receive critical acclaim at the time of its release back in 1960. However, while Psycho's enduring influence is undeniable, it's important to note it did earn the anger of censors upon its release, bizarrely for showing a, wait for it, drumroll, a toilet. Yep, the humble throne is what got Psycho in trouble with censors. As such, Hitchcock's masterpiece was trimmed down in order to avoid the ire of those moral guardians of the time. Also, there's long been a legend that there's a different cut of Psycho out there somewhere. One that features a far gorier kill for Detective Arbogast. There's a scene where Norman then hides that dead body. There's a supposed Hitchcock cameo, and even, apparently, an extended, more explicit version of that iconic shower scene. Ghostbusters 2: Demon Frogs, plus Eugene Levy. Given the success of Ghostbusters, expectations were incredibly high for Ghostbusters 2 when that rolled around 5 years later. And while Ghostbusters 2 was sadly a little underwhelming, maybe things would have been better had director Ivan Reitman decided to keep it a scene where a couple of subway workers discover some massive frog-like demons messing around with the tracks. Save for a few blurry screen grabs, these brilliant monster designs have sadly been lost to history, as the studio didn't care for the subway workers' comical reactions in this scene. On top of that, there was also a brief deleted cameo from Eugene Levy as Rick Moranis' equally timid cousin Sherman, a character who was to help the Ghostbusters escape the asylum in time for the sequel's finale, only to be left behind for his efforts. A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, Freddy lends Kristen a hand. considering many Elm Street fans consider Dream Warriors, the third movie that would be, to be the very best of the bunch, 1988 to Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master was always going to be up against it. Unfortunately, some view Elm Street 4 as the beginning of the end for Freddy Krueger, the tone becoming more comedic and outlandish, which is something that would only increase in the next couple of movies. And frustratingly, a genuinely sinister and terrifying sequence was ultimately dropped from Elm Street 4. A sequence where our heroine, Kristen Parker, is running from Freddy, dreaming she's in a hallway where Krueger's famed bladed glove is repeatedly bursting through the wall, before waking from this dream thanks to a cigarette burn. It's probably also worth noting that another moment cut from The Dream Master was Freddy imitating the stars of Miami Vice, with that pulled due to music copyright, which, let's face it, was probably for the best. Friday the 13th Part 3, The Alternate Ending. Friday the 13th Part 3 is a pretty big deal for us Friday the 13th fans. Not only did this film give us the fan favourite location of Higgins Haven and the fan favourite final girl Chris Higgins, but this is also the movie where Jason Voorhees first donned the iconic hockey mask. Oh, and we also got the totally badass Fox in a very small role. May Gloria Charles rest well. While some super brief footage has surfaced over the years, Friday the 13th Part 3 also nearly featured a properly trippy finale, where Chris would be lounging in a canoe much like Alice Hardy at the end of the original Friday the 13th, before Chris returns home to her boyfriend Rick, only for an unmasked and angry Jason to leap out and chop Chris's head off. Decapitation, you say? This was all set up to possibly be a dream, with Paramount deciding that not only was this a little too surreal, but that it was also a little too dark for what they wanted from the film. And so, Part 3 instead ends with a traumatized Chris being taken away by the police, head still intact. Event Horizon, the original cut. The lost footage from Event Horizon is a holy grail for some horror fans, although despite plenty of suggestions we might finally see the full 130-minute cut of Event Horizon, director Paul W.S. Anderson, he has stated that will never ever happen, with the once lost footage found supposedly in a Transylvanian salt mine, yes really, but then unfortunately too damaged to restore. The scenes removed from the theatrical release of Event Horizon include more of an in-depth look at the film's hellish alternative dimension, an extended glory orgy that would make Pinhead and his Cenobites blush. Instead, that extra 30 minutes of footage was cut into an unrecognizable few seconds of gory footage in the final film. Still, even now, approaching 30 years since Event Horizon's release, and some horror fans still hold out hope that somehow, one day, we will see the original lengthier cut of this most demented and unsettling of films. Black Christmas 2006, the trailer scenes. You've seen a bunch of trailers that have got you hyped for a movie, you buy your ticket for that movie, you get yourself cozy with some popcorn, hey, maybe a cold beverage too. Only for the penny to drop that, those scenes in the trailer that got you hyped, yeah, they're not actually in the finished film. In the case of the 2006 Black Christmas, that was very much the case, though minimal blame could be attributed to director Glenn Morgan. What happened here was, after filming was complete, Dimension Films, as in the Weinstein brothers, went behind Morgan's back to film additional scenes that were solely to be used in the trailer, not in the movie itself. So that trailer had an unnamed woman watching somebody stuck in a frozen lake. There were different kills to those seen in the film. There's a woman falling from a roof, and there's Michelle Trachtenberg aiming a shotgun and shouting, "Merry Christmas, mother." You can guess the rest. Oh, and Glenn Morgan was forced to change his intended ending, which would have been a nice homage to the original 1974 Black Christmas. So yeah, Glenn Morgan, done dirty, very much so here. Death Becomes Her, the happy ending. The 1980s saw Robert Zemeckis become quite the industry powerhouse, largely thanks to the films like Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and cheesy adventurer Romancing the Stone. And then he became one of the team to develop HBO's delightful Tales from the Crypt series that ran from 1989 to 1996, and is still very much missed to this day. That lovely slice of darkly charming horror TV attracted its fair share of big-name guest stars, both in front of and behind the camera, and that eventually led to Zemeckis tackling 1992's Death Becomes Her, a blackly comic horror that centered on two image-obsessed fading rivals as played by Meryl Streep and Goldie Hawn, who then go to ever-grotesque extremes to maintain their youthful appearance. And while the film has quite the cult following these days, one thing that following has been keen to see is Death Becomes becomes his original ending. There, Bruce Willis's Ernest would abandon both Madeline and Helen, ending up married to a bartender played by Cheers favourite Rhea Perlman, with Madeline and Helen then later finding the happily married retired Ernest 27 years later. Unfortunately, test audiences, they weren't keen on this ending, wanted a meaner, nastier ending, where we see a future that Ernest, he has died, and Madeline and Helen, they are pretty much held together by putty and duct tape by this point. A cure for wellness: drowning. Granted, Gore Verbinski's A Cure for Wellness might not quite have lived up to its potential once things really got going. The film did have some stunning visuals though, as part of its totally bizarre journey. Here, an executive is sent to get their boss from a wellness center, only to end up admitted to the mountainside retreat themselves, undergoing a range of horrendous treatments that are, they're quite something. One scene left out though sees Dane DeHaan's Lockhart forcibly drowned in order to take in oxygenated water, which results in him suffering a bunch of hallucinations that are even more weird, including some underwater ballet, a deer head taking a lovely bath, some good old tooth pulling, and some, shall we say, misplaced eels. For Gore Verbinski, he chose to scrap all of this in order to make Lockhart's epiphany come a little sooner, rather than using this creepy rascal of a segment. Halloween 2018, jog to a hanging dog? Right, first and foremost, let us know in the comments what you think about David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy. And remember, be nice, be respectful. To say it was opinion splitting is certainly something, with there's certainly some positives to those films, and of course certainly some negatives to the trilogy that took us back to Haddonfield and beyond. To go back to the 2018 Halloween that kick-started this trilogy, one scene that got left on the cutting room floor, for pacing issues apparently, is one where Andy Matichak's Allison is showing off her running skills. Hey, exercise is good, man. Be sure to look after yourself. Lord knows I need to get back into that stuff. But anyway, Allison is running when she just so happens to stumble across a crime scene being taken down by some locals. How convenient, yeah? But no, there's no human victims here. Instead, we have a strung up dead dog, which, let's face it, is even more disturbing than any human kills, because how dare somebody do that to a good boy or good girl? I mean, sure, rip open someone's jaw, stomp someone's head to mush, or turn someone's head into a literal jack-o'-lantern, but the dog? Nah, Michael, not cool, man. But then again, the very first Halloween, as in John Carpenter's iconic 1978 one, saw that no-good dirtbag prick Michael kill a dog there, and it was even implied in later films that he ate dogs. But yeah, this was probably one scene best left on the sidelines for the solid 2018 Halloween. But then, this is a trilogy that could have been better served to leave so much other stuff on the sidelines as well.